This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for signing in. Good morning to all, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon, of course, where you all are. Welcome to the sixth webinar for GSA for the year. It's been an exciting set of sessions, and today is going to be no exception. We have a great turnout, as always. It looks like we've got countries represented from all over, and we've got a great program for everybody. I want to take a time out just to thank RSNH, our title partner, for everything that they have been doing. And also, I just want to make a quick announcement that it looks like we're going to have 100% renewal for GSA membership this year. So thank you all very much. Quickly, what we're going to do today, I want to first just introduce several new members, Radiometrics, which is a weather-based company that just joined us, and Reach, Regional Development Group out of California. So welcome to both Radiometrics and to Reach. In our overall discussion today, we're going to quickly go over, obviously, George's introduction message, and also a discussion from Alan on the dawning of space tourism, and then I'll cover some issues regarding housekeeping. But first, what I'd like to do is introduce Matt Anderson from Air Liquide. Matt is the Senior Advisor of Government Affairs there, and he has agreed to chair a new working group that we've just set up. So without further ado, given the amount we have to cover, I'd like to turn it over to Matt to say a few introductory words. Matt? Is Matt not on yet? Steve, can you see?
Yeah, I guess he's not on just yet. Yeah.
Okay, well, based on conversations we've had with several associate members and regular spaceport members, it became quite apparent that having a working group that kind of took some of the work that George had done with his network development plan and kind of consider some of the issues attendant to policy matters that we might be able to work on to inform the community on some of the issues that would help the development of spaceport specifically. With that in mind, Matt has agreed to chair this working group, and we would like to encourage all of you to consider whether or not you would like to join this group. So if you would like to join it, please feel free to reach out to Matt directly or to Steve or George or myself, and we will make sure that the contact information is provided. If Matt does come on shortly, we'll make a point of having him say a few words as well. With that, though.
Hey, James.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I don't know. This is Matt Anderson. I don't know if you can hear me. I've had to dial in. I've encountered an error trying to sign onto the global go-to meeting.
Okay. Well,
but
Matt,
I am. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
Say a few words. Go ahead.
Yes. Sorry for the technical difficulties joining. Wish I could see everyone's faces, but just wanted to briefly introduce myself. I am Matt Anderson. I work for Air Liquide. For those of you who aren't familiar with Air Liquide, we're one of the world's largest industrial gas companies, and so the industrial gases and technology services we provide are primarily around hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, that sort of thing. So we have a lot of gases and ground service equipment offerings around the space industry. But as way of background of myself, I came from Capitol Hill, where I spent almost the past decade bouncing around in various jobs. My first 3 years on Capitol Hill were spent working for a Texas congressman who represented Ellington Field in Houston, Texas. So that was my first experience with the space industry, having represented that in our district directly. From there, I moved over to the House Appropriations Committee, where I spent some time on the Energy and Water Subcommittee, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee, which funds the FAA. So had a little bit of space experience there. And then from there, moved over to Air Liquide Government Affairs. So but very excited to work with everyone and kick off this policy working group. I think we're going to want to explore a lot of the start will be exploring how policy impacts the greater space industry with a specific focus on spaceports. And ultimately, the group and our work will go in the direction that the membership takes us. So I encourage everyone to either reach out to myself if you're interested, or someone from your organization is interested in participating. Again, my name's Matt Anderson. My email is actually matthew.anderson@airliquide.com. One of the joys of having a common name, there is another Matt Anderson in Air Liquide, and he claimed the matt.anderson email handle. But yeah, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the GSA leadership team, and they'll connect you with us. And looking forward to meeting you all.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you for agreeing to chair the group. I'm glad you managed to get through to us. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to George, our chairman, who's going to give a brief introduction and overview, and then introduce our guest speaker. George, over to you.
Thank you, James, and greetings, everyone. Just had a few editorial comments before we get to our special speaker today. Since our last GSA webinar back on July the 8th, there have been some very historic space achievements. July 11th, we saw Richard Branson and 3 others from Virgin Galactic fly Spaceship Two on a suborbital space flight. July the 20th, Jeff Bezos and 3 others flew a suborbital space flight on the Blue Origin New Shepard rocket. And then on September the 15th, Jared Isaacman and 3 others flew a 3-day orbital space flight on a SpaceX Crew Dragon that had been launched by a Falcon 9 rocket. I believe that those 3 missions over less than a 3-month span of time were very significant for commercial human spaceflight, for the global spaceport community, and for the future of our efforts in space. First of all, the missions demonstrated the potential benefits that private industry can bring to the table, as opposed to the traditional approach where government agencies planned, funded, and carried out most of what went on in space. And those benefits include lower cost, increased innovation, a greater risk tolerance, perhaps, new products and services, new customers and new markets, and new sources of funding and investment. The 3 missions showed us that with careful planning, the proper use of advanced technologies, and the incorporation of automation, streamlined training and procedures, and some out-of-the-box thinking, it is possible to significantly open up access to space to a much broader segment of the world's population than we have seen in the past. They have done that by flying women and minorities, the youngest person to ever fly in space, the oldest person ever to fly in space, and a cancer survivor with a prosthetic implant. Spaceflight is still risky, of course, but I think it may turn out that the general public is less risk averse than the government is, and that many people may feel that having an opportunity to participate in a once-in-a-lifetime adventure like going to space would be worth the risk. It's also clear that the 3 missions generated a tremendous amount of interest in the media and in the public at large, most of it very positive. And in addition, we've seen that human spaceflight can be used as part of broader efforts to increase awareness of the importance of STEM education and even to raise significant amounts of money for charitable causes. So I'm very excited about what has been going on and the progress being made. And I look forward to even more amazing things being accomplished in the months and years ahead. So with that, let's turn to our guest speaker today. I'm very honored and pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Alan Ladwick, currently the Senior Advisor for Star Harbor Space Academy, who will be speaking to us on the topic of the dawning age of space tourism. Alan has a BS and MS from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. At NASA headquarters, he was manager of the Shuttle Student Involvement Program and manager of the Spaceflight Participant Program, including Teacher in Space and Journalist in Space. That's where I first got to know Alan. It's more than 30 years ago now, hard to believe. He later served as a senior policy analyst for SAIC, came back to NASA as the associate administrator for policy and plans, served as chief operating officer for Zero Gravity Corporation, which takes those parabolic aircraft flights and makes those available to interested customers. And then returned to NASA as the deputy associate administrator for public outreach and the NASA Office of Communications. Currently, as I said, he's a senior advisor for Star Harbor Space Academy, and he's author of the See You in Orbit, Our Dream of Spaceflight book, which I have read and strongly endorse, and which is available on Amazon. So with that, Alan, over to you.
Thank you so much, George. And if we can get that first slide up, Steve, that'd be so I can advance them here. We have a lot to cover this morning. And in 20 minutes, I could talk about space tourism all day, but we've got about 20 minutes to go over three different things I want to talk with you about today. The first is, with all the recent news and excitement about space tourism that George mentioned, I want to give a quick historical recap of how we got here. Those of you that are in the younger set, and I can't see everybody, so I don't exactly know, but some of what I'm going to tell you is going to seem like ancient history. For some of us, it seems like yesterday. And so there's a disparity there on how we view space tourism in the historical context. Then I want to have just a few thoughts about what the role of spaceports might be in advancing the agenda for space tourism. And then I want to cap it off with just a very brief preview of coming attractions of the Star Harbor Space Academy. Originally, when I had accepted the invitation to speak, I thought I would be able to say a lot more about Star Harbor, but we still have a few I's to dot and T's to cross before I can give a lot of information. But with that, let's get started on some historical overview. Steve, can you, I'm not able to advance. Oh, there we go. So the notion of space tourism and the public going to space has been with us since the beginning of the 20th century. Early visionaries got this thing going with Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in Russia, when he wrote Investigation of Outer Space with Reactive Devices. And he talked about that in his space station, which you see on the left, in 1903, the same year the Wright brothers flew. And he thought that this space station might be flying as early as 1975. Then in America, the father of American rocketry, Robert Goddard, in 1919, writes his paper, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. And within a year, citizens from around the world were writing him letters volunteering to fly on his theoretical rocket. And the reasons were widespread. People wanted to become famous. They wanted to bring meaning to their meaningless lives. They wanted to run for political office. They wanted to send politicians into space on a one-way trip. And Goddard really wasn't all that excited about these letters he was getting because he felt it took away from focusing on his research. But the Smithsonian responded to all these people and said, you know, no rocket yet, stay tuned. And then in 1923, Hermann Oberth with the German Rocket Society He wrote his self-published book, Rocketry into Interplanetary Space. And he helped promote space tourism and the idea of space exploration over in Europe.
You should have control now. You should have control now,
All
Alan.
right, I don't seem to be.
Okay, well, then,
There we go. Up. There. Okay, we got it. Sorry. So then you go into the 50s, and the dream starts to grow more. The Hayden Planetarium did a Conquest for Space lecture with the German historian Willy Ley in 1950. And at that lecture, they had an interplanetary tour reservation booth set up in the lobby of the planetarium. And you could fill out a card. Where did you want to go? The moon, it would take 9.5 hours. Mars in 75 days. Saturn in 1,000 days. And people could fill out a card and say where they wanted to go. Estimated time of departure, 1975. So 800 people were in the audience that night, but over the next 2 to 3 years, 22,000 people wrote to the Hayden to get their reservation form. And keep in mind this reservation card in the upper left corner. I have more to say about that a little later. And then the second year, the following year, they had another lecture. This time, Werner von Braun and several of his colleagues joined the lecture, as did Navy engineer Milt Rosen. And here von Braun spoke eloquently about convoys to Mars with hundreds of astronauts, 70 spaceships at a time. Meanwhile, Milt Rosen from the Navy is trying to dampen down the enthusiasm a bit because he pointed out that we were routinely blowing up monkeys and mice at White Sands on rockets at that time. But when the press covered the event, they focused on the big vision and not the problems that Milt Rosen focused on. And at this time, there were a couple of editors from Collier's magazine in the audience, and they were inspired by this vision von Braun and his colleagues put out. So between 52 and 54, they put out an 8-part series in Collier's magazine. This was a general interest magazine. It was the first time this vision for space was brought to the public in such an exciting way, with illustrations drawn by Chelsea Bonstell and other famous space artists of the time. And then that in turn inspired Walt Disney to jump on the bandwagon of space. And he did a 3-part series on man in space. And it was man in space at the time. But again, von Braun and his colleagues were part of it. And the series showed things about space through artistic concepts, through animation, and through speeches and presentations by von Braun and his colleagues. And this really got the public going because here, you know, we all used, well, those of us of a certain age used to watch Walt Disney's Disneyland. And Walt came out to introduce the program every night. And it was a very exciting time for space. Then things started to get more serious with the creation of NASA. And then in 59, NASA announced they wanted to have a call for astronauts. And originally, NASA was going to put out a position description that allowed anybody that wanted to enter to submit an application. President Eisenhower put his halt to that. He thought it would be best to go with military test pilots because they've already been cleared, they have clearances, they knew what they were doing in a aeronautic environment. And as one NASA person said, that was a great decision because it ruled out matadors, mountain climbers, and scuba divers from applying. So we got our first 7 astronauts, the famous Mercury 7. They became overnight heroes. They were featured on the cover of Life magazine, and their individual stories were told. We got to know them very well, and our dreams were amplified through their personal stories. But notice in that bottom right corner that that's a nuclear propulsion ship. And in that same year that the astronaut, or just 2 years after the call for astronauts, Max Hunter, a engineer with Lockheed, presented a paper at the International Astronautical Federation that said nuclear-powered spaceships could carry us into space for $1 a pound. That ended up in Time magazine as a major article of the time. So it's no wonder that people were getting excited about the notion of space when it starts to appear in these general interest publications. Sorry, Steve, a little help on the next one. There. Then it took a while to open that aperture for people beyond test pilots. Beginning in 1962, the National Academy of Science kept promoting the notion that scientists should be included in the astronaut corps. There was a certain pushback of that at the time from NASA, but then in 1964, scientists were allowed to apply, and the first group of science astronauts were selected in 1964. There were women that applied in that call, but no women were selected. And you see here our first 6 science astronauts, or what they called the hyphenated astronauts at the time. Then in the 60s, you had the big push towards going to the moon. And there was a proposal by the Martin Company in 1964. Now, mind you, at this time, there'd only been 8 human missions in space. But in 1964, the Martin Company recommended to NASA that they fly a National Geographic photojournalist on a Gemini flight. Now, you can imagine how that went over with the test pilot astronauts at that time. And just 2 years later, in 1966, is when Neil Armstrong and David Scott on Gemini 8 had that horrible situation where they were going ass over tea kettle in their Gemini capsule trying to dock with a Athena spacecraft. And so we're not really in a really safe environment yet, but already people are thinking about non-astronauts flying on missions. Then in 1968, a year before Apollo, out comes the movie 2001: Space Odyssey. And those of us that saw it at the time got very excited seeing the Pan Am Space Clipper coming out of a space station, a Hilton hotel, and that got people all revved up. And then that inspired Pan Am Airlines in 1968 to create what they called the Pan Am First Moon Flights Club. And people that signed up for that got these membership cards you see on the right side. And over a 3-year period, 93,000 people signed up. I don't know if anybody here today with us has one of those cards or signed up at the time, but when I was the head of the Spaceflight Participant Program, many people sent me copies of their membership card, as well as people from the Hayden Planetarium Interplanetary Tour membership card to see if they could turn those in for a flight on the space shuttle. That's how badly they wanted to go. So then finally, in 1972, things started to pick up again, that maybe we'd have a chance to fly. And that was with the approval by President Nixon for NASA to build the Space Transportation System, for what Nixon said would take the astronomical cost out of astronautics. And at the time, it was predicted that the shuttle would fly 60 times a year, would only need 3 crew members. There'd be 4 seats for passengers. And again, people got excited. It was referred to in newspaper articles as the prairie schooner of space. So, of course, people got excited. Then in 1976, NASA put out a report, The Outlook for Space on Commercial Space Transportation. And they talked about how space tourism was going to be a routine thing in the very near future. Of course, over time, that 60 flights a year and the crew of 3, the 60 came down to 40. The crew went up to 4. The 40 went down to 30. The crew went up to 6. So things didn't exactly pan out as originally had been predicted. Then it took until 1978 where we got beyond jet pilots, beyond just science astronauts who had to learn how to fly jets, and we got mission specialists. It's the next big opening of the aperture for who could go to fly in space. And this is when we got what they call themselves the 35 new guys. And in that group of astronauts and mission specialists were the first women, the first African Americans, and the first Asian American. So again, things are starting to open up. People started to see representatives in that group of mission specialists that looked somewhat like them, and people got very excited. Then the next opening of the aperture was with payload specialists. And these were people that weren't full-time NASA astronauts, but had a special capability for an experiment that would fly on the shuttle. And it was felt that it was easier to train a payload specialist to learn how to fly on the shuttle than to take up an astronaut's time to learn how to do that experiment. So we got our first payload specialist on STS-9 on the Space Lab mission, Byron Lichtenberg, who was a colleague of mine at Zero Gravity Corporation, was the first American payload specialist. And then Alf Merbold of Germany, you see in the bottom left, was the first non-US citizen to fly in the shuttle. And then in '84, the first corporate payload specialist flew, and that was Charlie Walker, who you see on the right. And he got to fly his electrophoresis experiment, which he designed when he was at McDonnell Douglas. And he ended up flying 3 times on shuttle missions. Then you advance forward a few more years. In 1984, in August, it was announced that the first spaceflight participant would be one of America's finest, a teacher. And that created the Teacher in Space program, which eventually selected Krista McAuliffe as the primary candidate and Barbara Morgan as the backup. Of course, we all know how that mission turned out, not exactly as we had hoped. Just a year after the announcement of the Teacher in Space, we were going to have the Journalist in Space program, and that actually got down to 40 national finalists, but that program had to be canceled in April following the January tragedy of the Challenger accident. But again, we're starting to open up the aperture. People are starting to get excited about, boy, if a teacher can fly, if a journalist can fly, maybe I'll have my chance to fly. And around that same time, there were a lot of companies that were coming to NASA that wanted to promote space tourism. There were companies that wanted to put a module in the cargo bay of the shuttle, like you see on the left, that could have up to 40 seats. Seattle-based Society Expedition wanted to lease such a module, and they were going to charge $1 million a ticket. They eventually couldn't, NASA didn't accept that proposal, so Society Expeditions went to Pacific America Launch Systems, and they were going to build their own spacecraft, the Phoenix E, I think it was called. And you see that one on the right. For this flight, they were charging $50,000 a ticket, and they had hoped to have their inaugural flight on October 12, 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus landing in the Americas. Of course, that didn't come to pass either. There we go. Now, things started to even get more serious with the announcement of the X Prize. Officially kicked off in May of 1996 at a ceremony under the arch in St. Louis. Peter Diamandis, who came up with the idea, announced that there would be a prize, a $10 million prize for the first private company that could send 3 people into a suborbital flight, bring that back, and in 2 weeks turn around and do it again. He predicted at the time that within 3 to 5 years, somebody would win that prize. And then with 1 to 2 years after that, commercial tickets would be available. Well, it took till 2004 for the prize to be won by Burt Rutan, and Richard Branson was involved in that as well. And they got the $10 million check, which became known as the Ansari X Prize. And we'll tell you more about Ansari in a minute. So going forward still, we get more of a hope of people flying in space when they started flying space researchers to the International Space Station through Russia. This was very interesting to me at the time. Here we're the capitalist country, but it was Russia that was out doing commercial things in space. And our friend Jeffrey Manbear led the way when he was going to fly Dennis Tito to the Mir space station. Unfortunately, there was pressure put on Russia to deorbit Mir to focus on the International Space Station. And Jeffrey Manbear, and I think Rick Tumlinson was involved, and Eric Anderson from Space Adventures arranged to have Dennis be able to fly to the space station with the Russians. And at the time, this was in April of 2001 when he flew, but NASA and the European Space Agency were very much against having these people fly with the Russians to the space station. They didn't even want them to come onto the US or east side of the space station. But over the next 9 years, 6 other people flew to the space station, and that included Anoush Ansari, the first female Iranian American to fly, and Richard Garriott, the first son of a NASA astronaut to fly in space. And so that program started to go. It kind of petered away once the shuttle started flying because Russia wanted to use those available seats to sell to America to get our astronauts to the International Space Station. Then in 2019, there was quite the reversal of fortune by NASA. As I said, they were very much against the Russian program to fly people to the space station. But in June of 2019, they decided that you could have 2 short duration private astronaut missions per year for an up to 30-day stay. They were going to charge $35,000 a night, and this was to cover air, food, Wi-Fi, using the bathroom, but you still had to pay a private company $55 million to get there. Nonetheless, this created a lot of excitement, and both SpaceX with their Dragon 2 capsule, which we all are familiar with now because it's taken astronauts to the space station 3 times, and the Boeing Starliner, which you see on the right, which we're still waiting to have its first test flights. They were going to get into this business of not only taking astronauts to the space station, but also private citizens. So you'll see in a minute how this has been played out. So let the games begin. As George mentioned in the introduction, we had a great summer of space tourism. Virgin Galactic won the X Prize in 2004 and formed the company. And they first predicted that flights would take place in 2010. But it wasn't until 2021 when Richard Branson's dream was finally fulfilled and he was able to fly in space. Lately, that flight seemed to cause a little bit of controversy with FAA, and there was some talk of grounding them to do an investigation because there was a perturbation that happened on that mission. I think it was just yesterday, FAA has cleared them and they'll be flying again, hopefully by the end of the year. And then also Blue Origin got into the game just 9 days afterwards. They were actually formed in the year 2000, 4 years before Virgin, but they flew on July 19th of this year. They did something a little different for their passengers. Whereas Virgin flew some of its employees, Blue Origin had a bidding system, and the winning bid was for $28 million. And the person that won that bid had a conflict of it on his schedule and couldn't fly. I don't know, he had a dental appointment he forgot about or something. So another candidate from Denmark was able to pick up that seat and let his son fly. As being the youngest person to fly in space. But 7,600 people from 159 countries submitted bids for that flight. And of course, on that mission, in addition to Bezos and his brother and the kid from Denmark, was Wally Funk, one of the women that had dreams of flying in space as early as the Mercury program, and never achieved that until now at the age of 82. Now, who has been the real push behind a lot of space tourism, of course, is Elon Musk. He has changed the game considerably. His goal is to create a multi-planet species. He's done fabulous work with the Falcon 9. He's got this new spaceship that's being developed. He can land his rocket boosters both at sea and on land. He would like to launch an orbit around the moon with a private individual taking up to 12 people with him by 2023. He has said he'd like to send 100 people to Mars by 2030. And just yesterday, he announced that he's going to really bring the cost of flights down. And I'm going to quote what he said at a meeting yesterday. Our best case scenario is 15 million in cost per launch. And Falcon is about half to a third of cost of alternatives. With Starship, it could be 1% of the cost of an expendable system. The marginal cost of launch, we think, could be under 1 million with 10 times the payload of Falcon 9. Now, he hasn't said how soon he might be able to make this happen, but as many of his goals, it comes across as rather audacious, and he has this great vision of what he intends to do, and he's going out and doing a lot of it. And part of that was the Inspiration 4 mission, the first all-civilian mission to the space that George alluded to. It took off a couple of weeks ago with Jared Isaacman, the founder and CEO of Shift for Space Payments, and he in turn provided 3 seats for non-wealthy people to go along through different kinds of competitions. One of the people was Haley Arsenault, a bone cancer survivor from the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, and part of his mission was to raise money for St. Jude. They eventually raised over $225 million. I really like that aspect because it helped dampen some of the criticism about billionaires playing in space. And additionally, there were competitions where my colleague from Star Harbor, Dr. Cyan Proctor, got to go to be the pilot, and then Chris Sabronsky, who's got to be the luckiest person in the universe. A friend of his actually won the competition, but was unable to go, and he gave that flight to Chris. And I like the fact that in addition to raising money on this mission, they also represented 4 very critical values, and that was leadership, hope, generosity, and prosperity. And I think that really was a great differentiator on other missions, and it gave something that people could identify with. And of course, you've been living under a rock if you haven't seen some of the post-flight publicity of Inspiration 4, because both as teams and individual members have been on the morning talk shows or being featured in newspaper articles and magazines. Time magazine had a cover story on them, plus a special edition. Netflix has a series about them. It's just been remarkable the kind of attention this flight has given, and it's not for nothing the mission was called Inspiration. So where do we go from here? Well, there's going to be space stations and space hotels. Axiom, the company from Houston, plans, it already has a module up at the International Space Station. It is going to launch the first private crew to the space station. I think it's January or February of 2022. Sierra Space in the upper right has announced they're going to build a space station that can be used for research and tourism. And they are expediting the development of their Dream Chaser spacecraft. It's going to fly early next year with cargo, but they now want to expedite it to also develop it to carry crew members as well. And then there's the Voyager space station, which is the circular space station, and they say they could have 400 people in space by the year 2025. I'm a little skeptical on that one. And then there's the Dear Moon project, and this was Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa, and he has invited 8 people to join him on a mission that could have up to 12 people, and he wants a wider, more diverse audience to go with him. Originally, it was going to just be artists to go with him, and now he's expanded that, and he's in the process of selecting that final crew. What I hadn't realized, and I don't know where I've been, was he's also flying to the space station, I think later this year, to get some experience there before he does his orbiting mission around the moon. And he said he wants people from all kinds of backgrounds to join him, and that it'll be 10 to 12 people in all, but I will be inviting 8 people to apply to come along for the ride. So this brings us up to date with what all is happening with tourism. You see the history that we've had. You can understand, why did people think they're going to get to fly in space? Because for the last 70 years, we've been told by government officials, by visionaries, by the media, and by aerospace companies that our ticket to ride was just a rocket away. So where do we go from here? Well, given that we're talking with the Spaceport Alliance, I thought I'd better say a few words about this. I apologize for not also having a global map of where all the spaceports are, because I know this is a global audience. But I wanted to talk just a bit about how spaceports can be involved. And I came across a quote by former FAA Commercial Spaceflight Office Administrator Patty Gray-Smith, where she said, the late Patty Gray-Smith, one might look at a spaceport as an innovative new century version of what you remember airports first look like. They will be the gathering places for people to learn and witness for the first time the capabilities and benefits of space. So you spaceport managers and employees have a big task ahead of you and a challenge that Patty laid down many years ago. And what I found interesting was the space states that have spaceports represent over half of the US population. The states where there are, my math is right, represents 154 million of the 325 million people in the United States. So there's a huge constituency within your states where the spaceports exist. And we ought to be tapping into that constituency. You ought to make sure that people in the states are aware that you even exist. And how do you do that? Well, you can do that through those where it's possible. And not all spaceports seem to have this capability, but to have the public be able to view launches, to be able to have public tours. And I know several spaceports are already doing that. To get involved with STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math education. And you can do that through NASA Space Grant Consortium. There's a consortium in every state. And if your spaceport isn't connected with that consortium in your state, you ought to be, because it's a ready-made constituency, a group of space advocates, professional space scientists and engineers, and even communications people, policy people. And I think you ought to form partnerships with this consortium members, and I think you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish. And then also engage with environmentalists. I've seen 2 articles in the last week where environmentalists are not all that happy with space launch sites. It's happening with SpaceX down in Texas, and I just saw an article last night about the Camden spaceport in Georgia has quite a bit of opposition from environmentalists. So we need to reach out to the environmentalists, get them in on the early planning stages so it doesn't become this us versus them problem. Get them involved early on and have them become advocates of what you're doing. And then finally, the point-to-point demonstrations, I think, are going to be a critical part of spaceports. And as I've learned through your point-to-point working group, that there could be demonstrations of this in the 2022 to 2025 timeframe, and commercial service of point-to-point between spaceports could start as early as 2035. So I think that's going to be a very exciting time for spaceports because you'll have a lot of activity going on. Now, let me wind up with a few comments about Star Harbor Space Academy. As I said, originally I had hoped I'd be able to say a little more about what we're doing, but we're not quite ready for our grand reveal and to formally announce ourselves. We do have a temporary website, starharboracademy.com, and you can go there and sign up to get on a list, a mail list, to be kept informed of our near-term progress. We hope to be announcing by the end of the year. But our mission is to cultivate a sustainable and thriving future for all those on and off the planet. We believe the minds and technologies that solve our challenges in space will help solve many of our most pressing challenges on Earth. And this is why we're creating an affordable public access to the critical infrastructure and testing environments necessary for human spaceflight training and the rapid development of impactful technologies. And our vision is to foster a thriving culture of collaboration by establishing an environment where all explorers, students, trainees, researchers, government, military, industry, and entrepreneurs can work together and collaborate. We want to be the hub of space innovation designed to enable more solutions than would have been possible without the cross-pollination on our campus that we're going to provide. And some of the key features of just the training part of the campus, and it involves much more than that I can't really get into today, but some of the key training features are going to be a Boeing 767 for parabolic flights, for research and for adventure travel, a high gravity human centrifuge, a 4 million plus gallon neutral buoyancy tank, hyperbaric and hypobaric chambers, space simulation laboratory, and land-based and underwater habitats. And that's just for the training aspect. And our people that come to the campus will have access to the facilities, and we're going to be the only place where these are publicly available all in one location. So do stand by. So, see you in orbit? Well, let's see. Where is this going to go? I think we're still a bit of a long way from average citizens routinely flying, but hope springs eternal. And I like the phased market approach that Dr. Patrick Collins came up with at an IAC Congress in 1986. This was in October following the Challenger accident. So his vision and his prediction, I thought, is worth emulating. He had a pioneering phase. My dollar figures on this chart are different than his because I've adjusted them from the very low figures he had back then. But if you equate that, a pioneering phase would be where it costs $450,000 for suborbital flights and perhaps $55,000 for orbital flights. Now, just a few months ago, Richard Branson said his goal is to get flights down to $45,000. But right after that, he increased his price to $450,000. So it's kind of going in the wrong direction. Then you go to the exclusive phase, and that's where the price might drop to $150,000 for suborbital, $30 million for orbital, a mature phase, $100,000 suborbital, $10 million orbital, and a mass market phase for the holy grail of $50,000 for suborbital, $5 million for orbital. But if Musk is successful in this new goal he has set, maybe you adjust the prices within these phases, but I still think those are the phases you have to go through. There's 1.8 million people worth $10 million. The space tourism market is predicted to be 1.7 billion by 2028. So I'm very excited about all the things that could happen over the next 10 years. I want to mention one thing that Musk also said in his talk yesterday. He said that a multi-planetary human civilization is far from reality and that it's just a pseudonym for space tourism. But he emphasized that space tourism is not going to be accessible for everyone in the near future and will remain for the 1%. So even he, I believe, kind of backs this kind of a phased approach. So why are we all doing this? Why do people want to go in space? I just want to quote one thing from my book, and it was written by Dr. Mariana Singala from the University in South Australia. And she describes the impact of space travel in similar terms to what we all know about the overview effect. And that is that space tourism falls into a category of what is known as transformational services, which are consumed not just to satisfy basic survival needs. Transformational services enable people to rethink, to reset their value system, their priorities, the way of thinking, to learn, to self-develop, to change their attitudes, mindsets, or the behaviors or perceptions about certain things. And that's what got me into the space advocacy movement back in 1970, when Barbara Hubbard talked about an evolutionary spiral where space would help us see things differently, create new attitudes, and have new ways of thinking. So will an overview effect kick off in suborbital space? I having not been there, I don't know. And given the brief time you're in a suborbital flight, that 3 to 4 minutes, is there enough time to look out the windows and to get that awe-inspiring view of Earth? Remains to be seen. But I think it's something well worth striving for. And I want to end with a quote from 16-year-old Ruby Massengale of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And she had applied to the Hayden Planetarium Space Tourism, Interplanetary Tourism Forum back in 1950. She said by 1975, she'd be 32 and in an excellent position to take the trip. She didn't want to go for selfish reasons like money, fame, or adventure. She was interested in progress for all mankind. And I think Ruby captured the essence of what motivates many of us who have the dream of space travel when she concluded, "It seems like this longing is actually a part of me." So I hope this longing is a part of all you. I hope you've enjoyed this historical overview. Perhaps some of you did not know about some of this history. And I do encourage you to go out and check out the book. It's available in softcover or Kindle at Amazon. So thank you very much. And I hope I haven't taken up too much time, that we don't have time for a few questions.
Alan, thank you so much. That was awesome. Excellent. I think we do have some time for a few questions. Let me ask your perspective on, given where we are today, what is the government's role in space tourism, if any, at this point?
Well, that's a good question. I would hope that, and what many space advocates have been professing over the years, especially Rick Tumlinson, Charles Miller, and others, that it'd be nice if NASA would get back to the kind of the days of NACA, which they did with aviation, which is to develop the technologies, the cutting edge activities that private industry can't afford, but that the public sector could help finance, and then the private sector comes in and takes advantage of those technologies. Now, you've got somebody like Elon Musk that doesn't seem to be waiting for the government development. He's off doing his own thing. But I think there are many other companies that could benefit from new technologies if NASA was able to invest in those areas. And then, of course, also, not just NASA, but on the FAA side of things, is the very critical, as you know, George, the regulatory environment. And you were such a pioneer in trying not to have too many regulations at this beginning and give the industry a chance to grow. But I see a day where that's going to become more and more important, to at least have some kind of a regulatory protocols to ensure public safety.
Very good. So having had experience working with the Teacher in Space program and so forth, again, as things have evolved now, do you see a special value or opportunity in consciously, proactively allowing and enabling people like teachers, journalists, artists, musicians, and so forth to fly, or is that not necessarily that important now?
Well, I think it's still important. I think the more diverse demographics we can have represented in space, the better. The more other people will be able to identify with people in space. Plus, we have to get away from this criticism that it's just a plaything for billionaires. You know, billionaires spend their money on a lot of things some of us wish they didn't spend money on. I'm a follower of the Robb Report, and every day I get a tweet about some new outrageous thing that billionaires are spending their money on. So don't give me this crap about, well, it's, space billionaires, this and that. On the other hand, I think that billionaires trying to bring along other people of non-wealth is very important. And that's why I'm a big fan of Space for Humanity, which is Dylan Taylor's organization, with a goal to fly 10,000 people in space, beginning with suborbital activity, eventually orbital. And I think he even talks about maybe the space station and the moon. I mean, he's got a large vision, but I like that kind of thinking. I think one of the reasons that the Inspiration 4 mission is continuing to get so much coverage here 2 weeks after the flight is because of the normal people that went, the stories that Dr. Cyan Proctor has to tell, the stories that Chris Sabansky has to tell, Haley Arsenault with her hope and message she gives to young people at St. Jude's. I just can't say enough about the need and I think the benefit of flying a large, diverse population.
Excellent. And then finally, because as you mentioned, Global Spaceport Alliance is an international organization, we do have a number of spaceports and other countries. Can you say a little bit about potential opportunities for the international community in terms of, you mentioned point to point, but other mechanisms for collaboration and so forth? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not as familiar with the global capabilities as I should have been for this presentation. I'm sorry. But I would think that this collaboration, this network that you're building through the Global Spaceport Alliance is a great first step. I loved your paper that you all prepared. And I'm drawing a blank on exactly what you called it, but your position paper that you outlined all these policy challenges. I think having people from all over the other spaceports around the world help work on those types of things is critical. And the more we can make this kind of thing within the public dialogue and something people are aware of, I think the better. And I would just repeat the same things I mentioned about STEM education, about tours, about launches that I advocate for US. I would hope that our international partners can do the same. And I was very excited when I heard recently about the spaceport that Sierra Space has an MOU with. Shoot, I'm drawing a blank. Cornwall, where they're having a partnership there to do things on space tourism. So I think the more you get this cross-fertilization between American companies doing things over there and vice versa, the better off we'll all be. Excellent.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, but thank you again. Excellent presentation. Really appreciate you sharing your book and the kinds of ideas that you've come forward with. Thank you so much, and we'll turn it back over to James to wrap things up. James?
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you.
See you in orbit.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. Very much appreciated. I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items I'd like to touch on. First is that, as you all are aware, the Global Spaceport Alliance has an annual meeting, and it has been historically done in conjunction with Spacecom. And I'm glad to announce that this year Spacecom is going to take place at the Rose and Shingle Hotel in Orlando, Florida, January 10th through the 12th. And as part of that, we're going to have an annual meeting, the 7th annual meeting, on the 10th, and it'll be dedicated for the entire day. Preliminarily, we've put together a draft agenda for that, which we can make available to anyone who would like to see it forthwith. But typically, this meeting has focused on how you as members can collaborate with one another and talk to one another and have a real interchange of ideas and concepts. We're looking at several potential themes for the keynote and some other aspects of the caucus. It will certainly include some aspects of funding mechanisms that are available. We'll definitely look at tourism, and with some of the work that our working groups have done, we'll probably also focus on education and some of the point-to-point components of what is happening out in the marketplace. The other thing I'd just like to quickly talk to as well is that at SpaceCom this year, there's going to be, as a result of your membership in SpaceCom, in the Global Spaceport Alliance, I'm sorry, there's an opportunity for you all to take a booth at SpaceCom itself. And if, as members, you get a discount on that booth space. So any member who would like to take advantage of a booth opportunity, please feel free to reach out to Steve Wolf or myself, and we will help you provide all the details that you need. With that, I think we're at the top of the hour. If anyone has any quick questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Let me see, there's something's in here. Is there anything I need to look at? No, it looks like. So with that, I guess, thank you all very much for your attendance today. And we look forward to our next webinar, which will be taking place in the latter part of the beginning of November. And we'll be sending out details on that shortly. So thank you all very much and good luck. Bye now.